Can everyone hear me? Hello, 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 hello. Okay, so just one quick, actually a couple quick announcements. Um, so number one, I don't think I told this group, my wife had a baby the day after we met on Tuesday, on the 23rd. So that was cool, but exciting and terrifying and everything else. Let's see. Yeah, she almost had our child in the car. That was kind of a little scary. Oh man. Anyways, so I did switch. Thank you, Sandy. I'm gonna definitely need it. There's gonna be a lack of sleep from now for the next 3 years. There'll be little to no sleep. So thank you. Um, so I did switch a couple of the groups, two of the groups. So please look at the groups. I really only switched group 1 and 2. Hopefully there'll be a better synergy with the new makeup of the groups. Um, so group 3 which is I'll just refer to them as my tiny and mighty group. So I think you guys are down to 4 people. So this go around is going to be a little more challenging just because you got to develop your campaign from scratch. So those of you who have 4, it's going to be a little bit tougher for you. So the good thing is that you already know what the problem is. Now you just got to like figure out how to tackle it. What else? The biggest critique, and this is something you guys all have to work on, and I have to post up, by the way, the instructions for the final assignment, is your PowerPoints. The font that some of you use for your PowerPoints is way too small. Remember, we're seeing stuff on screen, right? So even the stuff that you see here on my screen, even for some of you, it might look small. And this is like 40 or even 44 font. And some of you were using font that was like, I don't know, like 12. It's like you were typing on the paper. And so the font really needs to be bigger. Otherwise, you're going to lose the audience. The audience can't follow along if your font is tiny. You want to use bigger font. What else? Also, you don't want to cut and paste everything from your PowerPoint onto your or from your I should say from your paper onto your PowerPoint. Your PowerPoint should only have like a few some points, and then you elaborate on those points. So you need to reduce the amount of text that you have on the slides for some of you. And so one of the duties that you'll see in the final the instructions for the final paper is there's actually somebody who's in charge of editing the PowerPoints and editing obviously the paper. One additional challenge for all of you, it's going to be the fact that presentations are going to be 15 minutes long. So that means you really have to coordinate. Some of you, I don't think anybody here did it under 20 minutes. So now you have to shrink your presentations down from 20 to 15 minutes. So that's going to be a challenge. So any questions? Where can we find the new group assignments? It's on it's the same place where you had. That's a good question, Rihanna. It's the place where you. How do you even? Where I assigned the groups initially, the chat rooms. the individual chat rooms for the groups. So that's where you can find your new group for 1 and 2. I hope that answered your question. I'll also send you an email. Right, exactly. Exactly, Steph. So we're now switching up in terms of like the last half of the class is basically me talking about the how various industries work. And so the first industry we're going to discuss is the film industry. We'll also discuss music. What else? Sports and travel. Those seem to be the 4 more popular industries. So we'll stick to those. Before I start talking about film and TV and the business of it, some people ask me about video games. Video games, honestly, is actually very, very, very similar to film. It's modeled in almost the exact same way. I mean, there's some differences, of course, but video game actually is very similar to film, and TV actually modeled usually more or less to a large extent modeled itself after film too. I mean, obviously there's a lot of differences as well, some differences, especially once you get into um, airing it on TV. Should be different. Yeah, the chat rooms should be different. Remember, I only switched 2 groups. That means some of the old group members are still with you. Okay. So if there's no other questions, let me see, no other questions. So a little bit about the history of movies. Of course, this will be on the last exam. Oh, if you're wondering what was the high score for the midterm, the high score was 100. So there is brilliance amongst you. Somebody got a perfect score, yeah. If you're wondering who was the high score in general, just in percentage wise, somebody also has 100% just in terms of the class so far. That means this person has not missed anything on the case studies, and this person got 100 on the midterm. So you're competing with brilliance. So, anyways, a little bit about the history. Nickelodeon is the first name given to movie theaters. And so the reason it's called a Nickelodeon is because they charged literally a nickel to go into these particular movie theaters. So again, it was the first name given to movie theaters, and it's called a Nickelodeon because they literally charged a nickel for admission. Carl Laemmle is important because he was an independent producer who created the star system. Does anybody know what the star system is or means? Does anybody know what the star system means? That's partially true, Jacob. how movies were rated. That's Kara. No. So Jacob's a little bit correct. So he's partially correct, but in order for the studios to build a movie around a star, they first had to know who that star was. And so for a long period of time, well, I shouldn't say for a long period of time, for a period of time, we didn't know who the stars were, because the stars were not given credit. There was no credit given to the stars. So in other words, you weren't saying, oh, I'm going to go watch that Tom Cruise movie or that Tom Hanks movie, because you didn't know who the star was. It's because it wasn't used for promotions. And so really Carl Laemmle created the star system, this idea of I'm going to use a star's name to promote the movie. And so he's really the first producer who started to use stars' names to promote a particular movie. And the first actress or actor to use his or her name for promotional purposes was Florence Lawrence. So again, Florence Lawrence was the first actress and actor, by the way, or actor to use their name for promotional purposes. And the reason, going back to the star system, the reason that producers didn't want to use actors or actresses' names for promotional purposes was because they feared that the stars would have too much power and they'd have to pay them more money, which turned out to be true. So the producers were rightfully fearful of giving the actors and actresses a lot of power. And so Carl Laemmle again creates the star system, independent producer. Carl Laemmle also ended the trust, and he ended the Kodak and Edison trust. So Kodak and Edison had a trust. So essentially, Edison had the hardware, controlled the hardware, and Kodak the film, obviously Kodak film. And essentially, anybody that wanted to use their equipment was charged a tax. And so Edison and Kodak were able to make a lot of money off of charging a tax. They would charge a tax to any film producer who wanted to use their equipment, and including even distributors that wanted to show the movie. Kodak and Edison would charge them a tax. And so Carl Laemmle ended up taking them to court, and Carl Laemmle ended the trust. So Carl Laemmle, a big deal, not only because he helped to develop Universal Studios, but he also, again, creates the star system, and he helps to end the Kodak and Edison trust. Any questions so far? So Florence Lawrence, again, first star to use her name for promotional purposes. She was nicknamed the Biograph Girl. So Mary Pickford was the first actor or actress to earn $1 million. So Mary Pickford, again, first actor or actress to earn $1 million. So something kind of interesting that a lot of people don't know was in the early days of movie making, actually women had possessed far more power than they do right now in the early days of movie going or movie making as well. So women were the movers and shakers in many cases in the early part of the movie industry. So if you're not familiar with Mary Pickford, this is a little bit about her.
At the start of the 20th century in America, women couldn't vote or go to college. But even before films had sound, they had a pioneering star, Mary Pickford. Long ahead of her time, Pickford wasn't afraid to demand pay equal to her male counterparts or take on the Hollywood studio machine. Born Gladys Louise Smith in Toronto in 1892, Pickford was performing on stage by age 8 at the urging of her mother after her father had abandoned her family and they needed the money. At 15, she landed her first part on Broadway and changed her name to Mary Pickford. 2 years later, she auditioned for a role on the big screen for director D.W. Griffith. She didn't get the part, but Griffith was so impressed with her that in 1909 he signed Pickford with the Biograph Company. That year alone, she starred in more than 50 films. Even though they didn't record sound, Pickford made it a point to memorize all her lines. And she took an interest in every aspect of filmmaking. When the enterprising actress wasn't performing for the camera, she wrote movie scripts for $25 apiece. Pickford was the original America's sweetheart, and she was one of the world's biggest stars, rivaling Charlie Chaplin in popularity and, eventually, in pay. On June 24, 1916, she became Hollywood's first million-dollar actress and added producer to her credits. That's when she signed a contract guaranteeing her $1 million over 2 years, and her company, Pickford Film Corporation, the rights to produce all of its own films. While estranged from her first husband, actor Owen Moore, Pickford fell in love with one of silent film's biggest stars, Douglas Fairbanks, who was also married at the time. In 1919, while the two screen stars waited out their respective divorces, they joined with Charlie Chaplin and D.W. Griffith to form United Artists, an independent distribution company which bypassed the big Hollywood studios and put financial control in the hands of the creatives. In 1920, Pickford and Fairbanks married and became Hollywood's first power couple, and were known to throw lavish parties at their Pickfair estate. Though Pickford would call Fairbanks the love of her life, the marriage would last only a few years.
So Mary Pickford, highly successful woman in the early parts of the movie industry. Her personal life wasn't quite as successful, but it was, pretty exciting. She did, date a lot. And so, but quite an intelligent woman in terms of a business-wise. Again, the biggest star in Hollywood, first star to earn $1 million, one of Hollywood's first executives, one of Hollywood's first studio heads, just in terms of like running United Artists, would end up being a company for many years. And so a very powerful woman within the movie industry, at least in the early part of the movie industry. Adolph Zukor is important because he's the guy who vertically integrated the movie industry. So he's the guy who vertically integrated the movie industry. And so basically what I mean by vertically integrated, he basically created under one studio, controlling production, distribution, and exhibition. So again, under one studio, in his case, he ran Paramount. And so they controlled production, distribution, and exhibition. So Adolph Zukor was the person who helped to vertically integrate the movie industry, again, to control production, distribution, and exhibition. And so Mutual Film Corp versus Industrial Commission of Ohio. I don't know what exactly is taught in comm law. I'm not sure if this case is discussed. Does anybody know what this case is, just out of curiosity? Again, I don't know. I'm not sure if what Professor Shepard or Erickson teach in terms of, I know they do a lot of First Amendment cases, but I'm not sure if they discuss this one. Films can't be censored. Well, that is a case, but that case comes along later. Very good, Melissa. Actually, in this case, it's actually the opposite. This case took place in 1915, and so actually, in this particular case, the Supreme Court actually ruled that movies were not protected by the First Amendment. So actually, in this first case, this 1915 case, the Supreme Court again rules that film is not protected by the First Amendment. So it's not protected speech. In other words, for this particular case, the state censorship boards can censor movies, because you have to understand the early days of the movie industry, the states themselves had boards that oversaw the content. In other words, they could censor content of a movie, and every state was different. And this 1915 case said that, yes, indeed, the individual states can censor a movie because a movie is not protected speech. Did everybody get that? All right, so the Hays Code, which results in then called the Production Code. So I'm sure maybe some of you are familiar with the Production Code that started in 1934 and really ended in 1968. And there was a code before then called the Hays Code, named after Will Hays, who kind of created a code called the do's, the not do's sort of thing. And so the Production Code, essentially, it evolved into the Production Code. And the Production Code was essentially some rules, things that you couldn't have in a movie. So, for instance, you could not have successful miscegenation, for instance. You couldn't say anything that was highly critical of religion, especially Christianity. You couldn't say things that were very critical of, let's say, the United States. And so these were some specific rules that were in part of the Production Code. The Production Code really becomes part of the fabric of our pop culture because of the Legion of Decency. The Legion of Decency was essentially this, not just Catholics, but mostly Catholics. It was driven by the Catholic Church, but there was other groups involved that essentially said that movies were terrible, that they were causing a lot of immorality in our country. And there was this huge push to ban movies in this country. And the movie industry initially ignored the Legion of Decency, but over time, as the Legion of Decency acquired more power, the studios started to pay attention to them and agreed to only air movies that were within the parameters of the Production Code. And so Joseph Breen, who you see here, the name, he's the guy who ran the Production Code Administration from 1934 into the early 50s. So imagine having one person overseeing the content of all movies for 19 years. So he was kind of like the person who was censoring content. And again, it goes back to the case in 1915, where it said that films were not protected speech. So it was perfectly okay for Joseph Breen to censor content, to censor scripts, because film was not protected speech. And so if you wanted to receive if a movie wanted to get seen or receive theatrical distribution, it had to be approved by the Production Code Office. So if you're not familiar with the Production Code, this is a little bit about Breen and the Production Code.
Gone with the Wind, Casablanca, The Wizard of Oz, Citizen Kane. These are some of the most beloved films in the history of American cinema, but they all share something else in common. They were all censored by the Catholic Church. In fact, for decades, there's a good chance you didn't see anything in a Hollywood movie unless the Catholic Church wanted you to. Hollywood in the late 20s was chock full of films about pirates, lovers, and monsters. But not everybody was happy about that. Most notably Catholics, some of whom were alarmed by what they viewed as the crumbling morality in motion pictures. Two devout Catholics, a publisher named Martin Quigley, and a Jesuit priest named Father Daniel Lord, that's his real name, decided to do something about it. In 1929, they wrote the Motion Picture Production Code, a set of proposed moral guidelines for movies. It prohibited such things as nudity, indecent dancing, and ridiculing religion, while requiring the promotion of Roman Catholic values where good triumphs over evil and immoral behavior is punished. There were also slightly less folksy provisions, like barring romance between different races, as well as white slavery. Yikes. When the Big Five studios, Warner Brothers, Paramount, MGM, Fox, and RKO, received the guidelines, they agreed to them. Why would Hollywood ever willingly sign on to censorship like this?
We always have to remember that movies had no First Amendment rights during this time. And that meant that any individual state or municipality, or by extension the federal government, could censor motion pictures.
This is Thomas Doherty, and these are his slippers.
There are real fears in Hollywood that Roosevelt's New Deal government, which is proliferating government agencies with great abandon, is going to create a federal censorship agency to censor American movies.
Studios chose to adopt it voluntarily, hoping that it would deter government interference. But then in 1930, the Great Depression hit. Following the economic downturn, movie attendance tanked, and studios scrambled to do whatever it took to sell more tickets. And what sells tickets? Sex, violence, and big-ass goblets of booze. So for a period of 4 years between 1930 to 1934, Hollywood studio films were pretty crazy.
The Roman Catholics especially get very upset by this. And in late 1933 and early 1934, they begin organizing something called the Legion of Decency.
What sounds like the lamest superhero franchise ever actually released publications of all studio movies with their accompanying rating. A being morally unobjectionable, B being morally objectionable in part, and C being the dreaded condemned.
The Legion had something called the Legion Pledge, and you have 20 million Catholics at Mass and at Knights of Columbus meetings would stand up, raise their hand, and pledge on their immortal soul that they would not attend motion pictures that the church deemed unworthy and unholy.
To avoid a devastating boycott, Hollywood created the Production Code Administration to enforce the guidelines, and appointed devout Catholic Joseph Breen as its head. Here's Edward Herrmann playing him in The Aviator.
And I can state categorically that I have never seen anything quite so unacceptable.
The Breen office would get a script from a studio, and he would go through them line by line to make sure that nothing was said or implied or visualized that defied the production code.
For instance, here's a couple of their notes on the Jimmy Stewart film, It's a Wonderful Life. Page 21. While it will be acceptable to indicate Gower as having recourse to drink because of his disturbing emotional problem, we must ask that he not be shown at any time offensively drunk, here or throughout the scenes. This is important. Page 37. The action of Harry slapping Annie on the fanny is unacceptable. Page 38. This reference to impotency is unacceptable.
The Breen office approved every aspect of a film, every image, every line of dialogue, ad mats, marketing, costumes, and it really makes him one of the most powerful men in Hollywood history.
And by extension, made his office one of the most influential in Hollywood. If you look in the credits of every Hollywood film from 1934 to 1954, you can see the PCA logo. Without it, your movie didn't stand a chance. The PCA got to say which movies the studios could make, and since the studios own many of the theaters in the country, most audiences only had access to production code films. You could almost call this arrangement a monopoly, and some people did. 9 people to be exact. U.S. v. Paramount Pictures was a landmark antitrust court case in 1948, in which the Supreme Court said this kind of monopoly was illegal and forced the studios to sell their theaters. Since the studios could no longer control what was shown, it opened up the floodgates for independent and European films, neither of which needed to abide by the code. The PCA quietly existed until 1967, when the Motion Picture Association of America took over and American film switched over to a rating system.
So
So now you see the precursor to the our current rating system is sort of based off of the Hays Code as well as the production code. So so Joseph Breen again ran the Production Code Administration Office, again one of the most powerful people perhaps in the history of Hollywood, at least for 19 years. He was, immensely powerful. Again, can you imagine nowadays having one person oversee all aspects of movie making for a 19-year period? It's nuts. U.S. government versus Paramount Pictures, as you just seen right now. Basically, what happened during that court case was that the U.S. government essentially told or forced the Hollywood studios to sell off a portion of their business. So that means getting rid of either their production, getting rid of their distribution, or getting rid of their exhibition. And essentially the studios all decided to sell off their exhibition. And so in other words, they sold off their theaters. And so really what ends up happening because of this particular court case is that it's the end of the old Hollywood studio system, and it kind of goes away because no longer were movies guaranteed a theatrical exhibition because the theaters were no longer owned by the studios. And last court case, and this is something that Melissa did mention about where it was not okay to censor movies, and that was the Bernstein versus Wilson, the Miracle case in 1952. And essentially this is the court case where essentially the Supreme Court says that films are protected by the First Amendment. So it took all the way until the early 1950s before movies were granted First Amendment protection. And so essentially, because of this particular court case, the power of the Production Code Administration Office kind of goes away. The power of Joseph Breen kind of goes away because the Supreme Court ruled in 52 that film was protected speech and essentially couldn't be censored by the government. Questions? Okay, so who were the first two networks? Anybody know who the first two networks were in network television? That's correct. CBS and NBC. Thank you, Sandy. And thank you, Rihanna. So NBC and CBS were the first two networks. And essentially the Supreme Court forces the NBC Blue Network to be sold to ABC. And so is anybody familiar with William Paley? And why he's important? Anybody? Somebody? Crickets. So Paley is the same person who, I'm not sure, I think Paley is, I think still the name of the museum, the Museum of Television over in Beverly Hills. I think it's called the Paley Museum, I believe. So William Paley ran CBS, and William Paley essentially is the person who changed the way radio programming was done, but also changed the way TV programming was done. And so really what he did was he got the idea that he should create programming and give this programming to the affiliates. And so what he did early on, at least for radio, is that he created radio programs, and then he would essentially give these radio programs to the affiliates. And so that he did the same exact thing for television. And so what he would do is CBS would create programming, and he would then give it or sell it to the affiliates, and then the affiliates would air it. And so what he did was that he helped to create a network of programming for content. He also is a person that created a synergy between programming and advertisers. This idea of having an advertiser advertise a specific show really started with William Paley. It was William Paley's idea, this idea of attaching an advertiser to a show. So that's the importance of William Paley. Candid Camera was the first reality TV show to be a hit. It was produced by Alan Funt. And so something important to understand was that Candid Camera was actually a hit on radio before it became a hit on TV. And again, produced by Alan Funt. Milton Berle was the first television star. So Milton Berle was the first television star. And essentially Milton Berle was known as Mr. Television. And he helped make television popular. In other words, people wanted to watch his show, his variety show. And so they started buying televisions so they can watch Milton Berle on TV. And so Milton Berle, in a lot of ways, is credited with helping to sell lots of TVs and helping television become popular in the United States. Frederick Ziv. Anybody familiar with Frederick Ziv? Is anybody familiar with the show? I think it's called Highway Patrol. Not the first broadcaster, but he was the first something, that's for sure. Anybody familiar with Highway Patrol? It's an old syndicated television program. Nobody familiar with Highway Patrol? So Highway Patrol was a syndicated television program that was produced by Frederick Ziv. And so Frederick Ziv is considered to be the pioneer of television syndication. Now, when I say this, I'm talking about first run syndication. I'm not talking about second run syndication because that's Desi Arnaz and Lucille Ball. But first run syndication was Frederick Ziv. And so what do I mean by first run syndication? So is anybody familiar with Family Feud or Wheel of Fortune or Jeopardy or The Ellen Show or any of these talk shows? Okay, so Wheel of Fortune, Family Feud, Jeopardy, Ellen, these talk shows and game shows are all examples of first-run syndication. In other words, they're produced to be sold on a market-by-market basis. So again, they're produced with the intent of selling this program on a market-by-market basis. So Frederick Ziv, what his show, Highway Patrol, wasn't necessarily on a network. And so what he would do is he'd go around to the various markets and he would sell his show, Highway Patrol, to the individual markets on a market-by-market basis. And so he is considered to be the pioneer of first-run television syndication. Did everybody get that? So don't mix up Frederick Ziv with Desi Arnaz and Lucille Ball, because they're a little bit different. So I'm sure most of you, or if not all of you, are familiar with Desi Arnaz and Lucille Ball. Obviously, they created together one of the best shows in the history of television called I Love Lucy, which was based off of a popular radio show called, I think it was called My Favorite Husband. My Favorite Husband was the precursor, the radio show prior to I Love Lucy. And so they really wanted to bring they're also responsible for bringing production to the West Coast. So most production, when I Love Lucy was about to be launched, most production was done in New York. And Lucille Ball, Desi Arnaz lived out in the West Coast, out here in Los Angeles area. They didn't want to go to New York and shoot their television show in New York. And so they essentially helped to bring television production to the West Coast. They also were the first to shoot their program on film. So if you ever watch Lucille Ball, I Love Lucy, I should say, you'll notice that it's very crisp and very clear. They didn't use cheap video. They used videotape, I should say. They used very clear film, which cost more extra. And so CBS, which at the time was going to be airing I Love Lucy, didn't want to pay for that extra cost. And so Desi Arnaz and Lucille Ball said, fine, we'll shoot it, we'll pay for the production, but we want to retain the syndication rights to it. And so CBS agreed to give them the syndication rights. And so essentially Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz are considered the pioneers of rerun syndication, right? Not first run syndication, but rerun. So they also were the first to shoot their program in front of a live audience, also the first to shoot one of the first to shoot their program in front of three cameras. So Desi Arnaz, Lucille Ball, super innovative in terms of what they brought to the television industry. If you're not familiar with them completely, this is probably one of their most famous episodes.
It's called classic television for a reason. Welcome to Ms. Mojo, and today we're counting down our... The only difference is now we have the passing of time to truly appreciate how much hard work it took to get this amazing moment in the can. Number 3, When in Rome. We're getting to the nitty-gritty here. The I Love Lucy moments that even the casual fan is likely to recognize. Lucy's Italian movie is just one of those episodes that everyone loves to revisit. And there's good reason for that too, as it's just another example of Lucille Ball's stellar knack for physical comedy. The plot is typically straightforward, as Lucy is asked to audition for an Italian film production titled Bitter Grapes. She decides to do some research for the role, mistakenly assuming that the film is about wine.
What am I going to tell Ricky when he asks where you are? Tell him anything you want. I have nothing to hide. Tell him the truth. Okay, I'll tell him the truth. Don't you dare!
The sight of Lucy fighting another woman as the pair are stomping out grapes to make wine the old-fashioned way never fails to get tons of laughs. Number 2, Conveyor Belt Mayhem. This battle of the sexes managed to create not one, but 2 of the series' most memorable moments, thanks to the old mantra of anything you can do, I can do better. The Ricardos and the Mertzes decide to switch places, with the girls heading off to work, while the guys stay home with the cooking and cleaning. The end results went on to become comedy gold, as not only do Ricky and Fred nearly destroy the kitchen with their attempts at cooking, but Lucy and Ethel one-up them with shenanigans of their own. We're talking about the iconic conveyor belt sequence, where the ladies cannot keep up with all the chocolates they're supposed to wrap. Watch it right now. You will thank us.
I think we're fighting a losing game.
Before we unveil our number 1 pick, here are some hilarious honorable mentions.
Honey, you knew that we were going to have dinner with the Mercers. Why did you just tell them the truth?
You can't tell people the truth. They think you're lying. You have to lie to make them think you're telling the truth.
Mamãe, eu quero. Mamãe, eu quero. Mamãe, eu quero, mamãe. Ai, dá chupeta, ai, dá chupeta.
Cierto? Bon, et vous puis cet argent?
Wo haben Sie das Geld her?
¿Dónde toma ese dinero?
Where do you get the money?
What do you do? My name is Superman.
Oh, boy, am I glad to see you. Tell me, when you're flying around, do you have Cape trouble?
No, but then I've had a lot more flying time than you have.
All right.
You heard any good stories lately, George?
Number 1, Drunk on the Job.
Yeah, I need someone with a lot of experience.
Well, I've had experience.
Lucy finally gets onto Ricky's show. Well, sorta. She gets to be a live pitch girl for what she believes is an all-natural health drink. What she doesn't realize is that it's almost 0.25% alcohol.
It's so tasty, too.
This, combined with the multiple takes Lucy has to do where she tries the stuff, means that by the end of the episode, well, she's just completely smashed. Hearing her get progressively more loose with each take is funny enough, but Ball's facial expressions and delivery just hammer this clip home as the definitive hilarious moment from I Love Lucy.
So why don't you join the thousands of happy, peppy people and get a great big bottle of, Vita, Vidi, Vidi, Meeny, Miny, Mo.
Do you agree with our picks? Check out.
So again, one of the best shows ever made. It's pretty timeless. You know something's really good if after, 70 years or something like that, people are still laughing at some of these episodes. So again, one of the better television programs ever made by this duo of Desi Arnaz and Lucille Ball, who, by the way, would end up also producing other shows here on the West Coast. So they didn't just produce I Love Lucy. So Action for Children's Television versus the FCC. Basically what this enables is it enables for the ability for safe harbor. Basically safe harbor meaning that the networks are allowed to air indecent or racy content between the hours of 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. The rationale and the reasoning behind this was the idea that, well, little kids should not be up between the hours of 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. So therefore they can air, they being the networks, can air content that's a little more racy and more appropriate for, I suppose, for adults and less so for kids. So anyways, let's get into the various parts of production, of finance, marketing, distribution, so on and so forth. So what are the producer's primary responsibilities? Essentially is to, first and foremost, is to find material for development. So number one thing is find material for development, number one. Number two is to pitch ideas to investors or studios. So again, pitch the ideas to an investor and or studio. Number three, secure green light. So number three, again, secure a green light, which means in the movie industry and as well as TV is essentially production and distribution both agree to air or to finance the show. So again, it means that production and distribution have agreed to air or finance the show, I should say. So again, number three, secure a green light. Number four is understanding, though, that the producer is the boss. He or she, right, can hire or fire anybody on the set. They're also sort of like the moderator or the person that's mediating between the production of the movie and the studio. So, right, the studio is over here in Hollywood, and the production of the movie might be, I don't know, in the Philippines. And so the producer is in constant contact with the studio and basically letting them know what's progress going like. Is progress going well? Is it going slowly? So, and again, the producer is sort of the mediator between the production and the studio, as well as the boss. They're both. Also, the producer is responsible for making sure the movie's under budget. So again, under budget or at least on budget. Number six, delivered on time. And number seven, and this is a big one nowadays, is make sure that all contracts are read. So again, number seven, make sure all contracts are read. So number one, again, is producers' attempts to find material for development. So attempts to find material for development, pitches idea to investors and studios or studios, secure green light. Number four, they are the boss, right, on the set. And again, they're sort of the mediator between the production of the movie and the studio. Number five, make sure that's under budget or at least on budget. Number six, make sure it's delivered on time because you only have a certain number of days. And number seven, make sure that all contracts are read. And this includes having like sex riders or clauses. Has anybody ever heard of these phrases, sex riders or clauses? Has anybody ever heard of the phrases, sex riders? So this has become very important, especially in the era of Me Too. This idea of making sure that the producer, director has read the star's writer and any sort of clauses that might be in the contract. Like, for instance, if there's any sort of nudity going on in the movie, they got to make sure that the star, the celebrity, is okay with it, and based off of what the writer says. So that may mean, for instance, that the scene may have to be rewritten in order to meet the parameters of what the studio's contract says. And so this is really important, especially in the era of Me Too. And so what are the 4 parts of negative cost? It's acquisition. In other words, you want to turn a book into a movie, how much is it going to cost? Acquisition. The development is part of acquisition. So the second part of negative cost is pre-production. That's the hiring of the big stars. That's the hiring of the director, those sorts of things. Number 3 is production. That's the labor-intensive part of making the movie. And number 4, it's post-production, which is things like editing, special effects, those sorts of things. So again, number 1, acquisitions. Number 2, pre-production. Number 3, production. And number 4 is post-production. And those are the 4 parts of negative costs. The negative being how much does it cost to make a movie. They refer to it as the negative because you're shooting film on a negative. So film financing. So studio financing is always a little bit easier. So anytime you have the studio saying, yes, we're going to give you the money to make a movie, or they agreed to acquire your movie afterwards, which is a little bit different. But any sort of studio financing is always easier. The reason that it's easier is because, you know, the studios do have lots of money, and even if you go over budget, I mean, they're not going to be happy about it, but it's pretty much assured or a guarantee that the movie's going to be seen in theaters, distribution-wise. The one drawback when it comes to working with the studios is that you give up creative control. So that's the one drawback, is that the studios want to have creative control over the content, and sometimes the producer, well, doesn't have any choice in some cases. Negative pickup. Is everybody familiar with what I mean by a negative pickup? Okay, so pickup means essentially that the studio agrees to pay for a portion of the movie. So what I mean by that is they may agree to finance, they like the idea, but they don't know who you are. So they might say, well, we'll finance the distribution and that's it. And so in order for you to secure an investment in making the movie, you essentially needed the studios to say okay to distribution. So a negative pickup means that you have a third party, like a bank, that agrees to pay for the production of the movie. So whether that be a rich person like an Oprah Winfrey or a Tyler Perry, or whether that's a bank, they're not going to pay for the production of the movie until they know for sure that distribution is being paid for by the by the distributor. And so essentially what negative pickup means is that the distributor is going to come by a studio and they're going to pick up the negative once the negative is done. So oftentimes, generally speaking, if you want a rich person, an angel investor or a bank to pay for your movie, they're going to require you to finish a completion bond. A completion bond essentially means that you have to go out and hire a firm, and the firm essentially provides insurance that you promise to complete this film. And so this completion bond company can essentially fire you from your own movie if you don't finish the movie in a timely fashion. And so an angel investor or a bank is going to require you to secure a completion bond deal with a company who does this in order to make sure that you finish the movie. Does that make sense? So you could get fired from your own movie. So other sources of financing, a film project without a major distributor involvement until acquisitions deal. You can do what's called crowdfunding. In other words, lots of people invest money in helping you pay for production. Is anybody familiar with Veronica Mars, the television show? So Veronica Mars, okay, one person's heard of it. Two people have heard of it. So what ended up happening when the show finished its television run, people were not happy with the way it ended. And so they actually ended up making a movie that sort of extended the last part of the television show. I've never seen it, but that's what I've heard. But the way they were able to raise the money to make the movie Veronica Mars, they used crowdfunding. In other words, a lot of people donated. They paid $10, $20, whatever, and they were able to accumulate lots of money, and they were able to make a movie out of this. So that's one way of financing a movie. Number two, angel investor. So that question mark is an angel investor. So again, this could be a rich person like an Oprah Winfrey, Tyler Perry, somebody that you know has lots of money who's willing to take a chance on you. And so an angel investor who drops from the heavens. And so that's the second way to finance a movie. Now, that being said, they're always going to want an ROI, a return on investment. And again, going back to the idea of a completion bond, an angel investor is going to want to hire a company that promises that you're going to actually finish the actual movie. They're not just going to give you money. And so the completion bond company essentially is insurance for them that the movie will get made, even if you get fired, even if you die on the set, the movie's going to get made, right? And so the completion bond company ensures the movie will be completed. The third way to finance a movie is called international pre-sales. Has anybody ever heard of the American film market? Well, the American film market it takes place every year. You should have gone, Jacob. It's a great place to go. Every year they have the American film market in Santa Monica. And so, and this is where all the major distributors from all these different territories get together. They essentially buy movies, essentially. And so let's say that you want to sell a movie to France or to Germany or to Hungary or to Brazil. And so they'll pay you a certain dollar amount for the rights to distribute that movie in that particular country. And so they're looking to buy movies. And you should have gone, Jacob, really. But anyways, it's also a place, the American film market is also a place where you can approach these buyers and say, hey, I'm thinking I have this idea for a movie and it's not made yet, but it's almost in the can. We can show you some dailies or whatever. And essentially pre-sell the movie before it's actually completed. And so Germany might give you, 4 million. France might give you 5 million. Brazil might give you 1 million. Argentina might give you 2 million. So you can use these international pre-sales internationally to help pay for your production. And then when the production is done, you give them the movie. You give that distributor for France the movie. You give that distributor for Germany the movie, that distributor for Brazil the movie, that distributor for Argentina the movie, and they show it in their particular territories. And again, if you're going to do an international pre-sale, again, all these folks are going to ask for a completion bond, which again costs between 3 and 4% of whatever the budget is. And so the idea of the pre-production, the pre-sale, is that you pay for your production through the pre-sales. And again, anytime you sign a completion bond, you kind of give up creative control and you could get kicked off the production. So now that being said, international pre-sales, if you do that, if you go that route, the studio's not going to want your movie, most likely. And the reason that the studio's not going to probably not going to buy your movie, most likely, is the studios want to monetize every single territory. They just don't want to monetize United States and Canada. They want to monetize the world. And so anytime you pre-sell it to different territories, the value, at least for a Hollywood studio, goes down because the Hollywood studios are thinking about global sales, not just the US and Canada. Hopefully that makes sense. Number 4 is tax incentives. So another way of financing your movie, and some call this soft money, by the way, don't forget that. Some people refer to this as soft money. And so this is where state or international, foreign countries or other countries give you tax credits for shooting the movie in that particular state or country. So for instance, you might have heard before the pandemic hit that there was a lot of movies being filmed in Texas or in Georgia or in the Carolinas or other parts of the other states throughout the Union. And what these states were doing was that they were giving tax credits to these producers. In other words, giving them rebates or giving them breaks on the production cost. And so, but the filmmaker had to shoot a certain percentage of the movie in that particular country or in that particular state. And part of these incentives also goes along with, you have to hire a certain number of people who live in that particular state in order for you to qualify for these tax incentives. And again, some people refer to this as soft money. So don't forget that, soft money. And last but not least is gap financing. So basically what this means is that, let's just say you have an angel investor, and that angel investor is going to give you $20 million, which is pretty good. But let's just say for whatever reason you went over budget, it's going to cost you $25 million to make the movie. And so you're going to need somebody to fill in that gap, that $5 million gap, right? You have 20, your budget's 25. You need another $5 million. And so a bank, right, may provide this gap financing that fills in that $5 million gap, which again, you have to pay with interest. So any questions on film financing, what I just talked about? Pretty complicated stuff, actually. Okay, so finance is actually, has everybody ever heard of the boilerplate contracts? Has anybody ever heard of that phrase, boilerplate contracts? Another way of thinking about boilerplates is just standard contracts. The thing about entertainment, they never use just easy words. They always have to use some sort of different word. But essentially, boilerplate means a standard contract. And so I don't know how many of you are interested in working in the film industry, whether it's on the producer side. But the attorney should read the PFD deals. And so P stands for production, F stands for finance, and D stands for distribution. So we'll just talk about the finance part right now. And so the finance part within a PFD deal usually just talks about, okay, the specific distribution rights the distributor will receive. So again, going back to the studios almost always want global rights. Anytime you pre-sell a movie, it loses value for a Hollywood studio. But again, if you're not working with a Hollywood studio, then who cares? And so when you do one of these deals, it tells the finance part tells the financier which distributor has rights to what specific territory. It's going to tell in the contract if there's going to be an advance paid. So in other words, are you paying the producer $1 million before the movie's released? How are we going to recoup the advance? Because whenever you get an advance, that means on the back end, you're not going to make as much. So one thing you have to understand for movies and as well as for TV is that you either pay the price in the beginning or you pay the price in the back end. So you either pay the price at the front end or the back end. Either way, you're going to get hammered by the studios or by the distributor. And so if they pay you in advance, that means at the back end, if it becomes very successful, you're going to make less. If you don't get an advance, you can make a lot more if the movie's quite successful on the back end. So this is what I mean by recouping. What will be the distribution fee? Generally speaking, for North America, and when I say North America, I'm referring to Canada and the United States. Mexico, even though it's part of North America, it's not considered part of North America, at least not when it comes to the movie industry. They think of it as Latin America. And so distribution fee is 30%, generally speaking, in North America. International, it's 40%. Now, it can vary depending on whether or not you're paying for the distribution costs. So how much will it spend on P&A? P&A stands for prints and advertising. The studio or the distributor is going to tell you how much they're going to spend on prints and advertising. Are they going to give you $1 million? Are they going to spend $1 million to promote the movie? Are they going to spend 10 million, 20 million, 40 million, 50 million? And again, part of that's going to be based off of how much the negative costs, what was the film's negatives cost? Again, the 4 parts: acquisition, pre-production, production, post-production. How much does the film cost? So generally speaking, right, marketing is about 50% of production costs, not always, but often. And then how are profits defined? Are they talking about a contractual break-even, a floating break-even, or a straight break-even? And so we'll talk about that in more detail later. And always pay attention to Hollywood accounting. This is what people always refer to this. I'm trying to. If you look at Hollywood accounting, this is a picture. This is a clip of Harry Potter, The Order of Phoenix. And as you can see here, you would think the movie made a lot of money and was theatrically very successful. But as you can see down here, where it's in parentheticals, you can see that the movie actually lost $167 million. And one of the biggest reasons why it lost $167 million was the fact that they spent $131 million just simply in advertising and in publicity, plus they charge a 10% overhead. So anytime you have the studios paying for your marketing, know that they're charging you an overhead fee of 10%, plus whatever they spent on advertising and publicity. And so this is what I mean by, or what people refer to as Hollywood accounting. And so Hollywood has a way of making movies that seem successful end up not being successful through their interesting ways of accounting. No questions? So this little clip has a really good idea, gives you a good overview of how independents finance movies versus studios. And what this guy's saying is so true. As somebody who used to work in the movie industry, it is, oh my God, this guy is like channeling me. Well, I'm channeling him actually because he's older than I am.
The studios can't formalize that business. They basically go in, make a movie for as little as they can make them for, and now that seems like somewhere between $100 and $200 million. And then they spend as little as they can to market it, which these days looks like around $40 or $50 million. And then they all just go back to their mansions on Friday night and start praying to whatever particular god that they're involved with, and hope that on Monday they don't get too much flack if the movie bombed, that they still have a job, which is, in most cases they do, which is mind-boggling that the studios keep relying on the same people who've made a bunch of bombs for them. But that's the studio system. In the independent film business, we tried to, and it has been to some degree become formularized. And we tried, when I was making films for William Morris, making lots of movies at the same time, it was much easier for us to really start to formularize how we were going to do it each time out of the gate. And the way that you do it, this doesn't, I don't mean to sound simplistic, but basically the same process that we all go through is you look at your movie, you figure out what's the least you can make it for, you go to some foreign sales companies, you get them to do some estimates based on what they think with the package that you have, the director and the star and the script and the genre, and they tell you what they think. You go to 3 or 4 of them, and that's much easier said than done, because they got to have prior relationships with these people. But I'll get to that one in a second. You go and you figure out what they think they're going to sell the movie for, and they come up with a list of what they think. Germany, France, Italy, Spain, Japan. Every country in the world, there's about 40 of them, and they do a list of what they think is going to be what they're going to ask people for in each country, and what they ultimately think they're going to receive. The worst case scenario, what are they going to get in each country? And then banks look at that line of the worst case scenario, and they add up the number at the bottom. And I'm making this up. It says $3 million total. Then you know that after they take that distribution fee off the top and then all their costs off the top, that you're going to probably end up, if you're lucky, with about $2.5 million. And then the U.S. distribution is really tricky, so you probably write down 0. And then so you got $2.5 million, and you got this budget that's whatever. You should be trying to make your movie for, in my mind, around $2.5 million. You should, and if that 2.5, and you can add to it maybe the soft money, or maybe you don't, and you reduce the risk even more by taking it down to $2.2 million. But you're trying, in my mind, to every time out of the gate go make a movie. And I'm not saying this happens all the time. And a lot of friends of mine don't do this, and so this is where they start to lose money in movies. You try each time, in my mind, to make the movie such that you're not going to get the $2.5 million up front from a foreign sales company. They're not going to give it to you. They're going to eventually sell it there. And what you're doing is going to investors saying, I think eventually we're going to get back $2.5 million from the foreign. They say it's 3, but we take that, the distribution fees that cost, in some countries that won't sell. We think we're going to get $2.5 million back. We're going to get $500,000 in soft money on my movie. So it's really a $2 million net cost. And if we make it for that, then we still have a little bit of room in against the foreign if they don't quite pay off. And the U.S. will be the upside for the movie. That's what you're thinking. Now, other people do it differently, and they put in a number against the U.S., and they put in all these foreign numbers that are much bigger, and that's where they get murdered, because it turns out that, in fact, you're probably much closer to the truth, which is it's the lower number, and maybe it's a 0 in the U.S. So that's a little formula. It's worked fairly well for me over the years. And there are some movies that don't fit these formulas. There's comedies like Napoleon Dynamite. You could never do that with this with that kind of movie, because no foreign sales company is going to take a movie that's a purely an American comedy and give you any numbers whatsoever, because they say, who are the stars? Never heard of them. Okay, that's worth zero. And in fact, it's not worth zero. The movie did extremely well overseas.
Actually, it's worth just about zero, because
Is it?
it did $44 million in the domestic box office, but $1 internationally.
Right.
So any foreign sales company that would have looked at it would have been completely right in saying there's no star and this comedy will
So
not.
your premise to your investor was 100% right. You could lose the entire $500,000. So take a shot here, because it's a funny movie, and if it really works, it's really going to work.
So, does everybody understand what he was saying again? What is soft money again? Do you guys remember what I said about soft money? What did I say soft money was? Do you remember? Right. Exactly. Very good. Paying attention. Yes. So very good. Yes. When he says talking about soft money, he's talking about the tax incentives. So again, where it's states or countries are going to give you tax incentives for shooting the movie in that particular state or that particular country. And so that essentially extends your production budget even more so. This is why I get on referring to the soft money, which people again call it soft money, but it's tax incentives. And so, any questions so far? So the way it works for movies, okay, the pitch is done. And so now the studios like the pitch, they like the idea, they agree more or less that they're going to finance the idea. And so things that the studios consider is the idea, but not just the idea, it's also the writer that's attached, the producer, the director, the studio exec, all these sorts of things. They have to sort of like the idea of this particular movie and the people involved in that particular idea. The studio also wants to know, where does the idea come from? The reason that they want to know this is because they want to have an idea of how much it's going to cost to acquire this particular idea. So if it's from a book, let's say it's a Stephen King book or a J.K. Rowling's book or something like that, it may cost more because these authors have a track record. If it's based off of a comic book, especially now that we're living in an era where comic book movies, seem to be pretty popular. And so that's going to be expensive to acquire. Other things to consider when it comes to film development: is it a good idea? And I'm referring to is it a creative idea, or the script's not a good script. What I'm referring to here is, does it make sense from an artistic perspective or a business perspective? So for instance, some studios are going to make movies that are called, award-winning films, right? In other words, they're films that earn the Oscars, and the studio is not, a lot of these movies, is not going to make a lot of money business-wise from this particular movie. From an artistic perspective, it's a good idea, but it's not always a good idea from a business perspective. And so sometimes these two things, they work in sync, right? If you think about Black Panther, artistically great movie, but from business perspective, also a great movie. But artistic or business are not always in sync, right? So I've written a script people tell me it's a good idea from an artistic perspective. It's a good idea. It's a decent script. From a business perspective, it's terrible idea. And so what I mean by that is because my movie takes place in the 1950s. So it's a period piece. And if I was a famous writer, then the movie, well, might get made. I shouldn't say would get made. Might get made, but because I'm a nobody, and because it's a period piece that takes place in the 1950s, period pieces are, from a business perspective, they don't make money, even though the idea is a good idea. From a business perspective, it may not be. Hence the question mark, right? So understand that when studios are making movies, they're looking at things from not just an artistic perspective in lots of cases, but they're also thinking about it in a business perspective. So sometimes these two things, again, they jive, they're in sync, and sometimes they're in contradiction. And so the studios examine 6 things when it comes to film development. Besides the idea, whether or not it's a good idea, whether or not it makes sense from a business perspective or artistic perspective, they also look at similar stories. Are similar stories being made, number 1. Number 2, they look at the genre. So for instance, Westerns right now, not being made. Dramas, okay. Horror movies, okay. But they look at the genre, number 2. Number 3, does it require a major star? Number 4, is it easy to market? Is it marketability? Easy to market. Number 5, can you create other revenue streams? In other words, can this generate lots of streaming revenue? Will there be DVD sales? Can you generate merchandising sales? Those sorts of things. And number 6, international appeal. So again, similar stories being produced. Number 2, genre. Number 3, does it require a major star? Number 4, is it easy to market? Number 5, can you create other revenue streams? And number 6, does it have international appeal? Because as you know, most movies nowadays, the majority of the box office comes from outside the United States, not within the United States. And so the studio is also going to look at movies with universal appeal because they tend to perform better, not only in the United States, but also abroad. And so oftentimes the way it works, at least in the movie industry, if the studio likes your idea, they're going to buy it. So option means that they bought it for a period of time. So they bought the rights to your movie, let's say for 2 years, and then they have to do something with your movie within that 2-year period. And then oftentimes, if that's the case, it might get rewritten, but you've already lost the rights as the writer, and so your original script, whatever it was, at the end of the day might be totally remade, and the script that you worked on for years might get destroyed by the studio. So scripts are optioned for a period of time, bought, and then they're oftentimes rewritten by some sort of script doctor. And I think it's already 5:30. Doggone it. Time flies. That was quick. It flew by really fast. So again, hopefully you guys review the client information now that you're back from spring break, and please, start, developing a plan. Their idea is pretty interesting. This idea of the is it FTD. That's interesting. So try to come up with the best plan that's going to secure the most number of streams, the selling of the albums, and the FTDs. I believe that was FTDs that they referred to. And so those of you who are in your new groups, right, get to know one another. Hopefully there's a better chemistry with all of you. Do ask questions. John gave you his email, so please reach out to him if you have any questions. He's pretty quick about responding, so please reach out, ask questions. It's important. So if one of the lessons learned from this first go around was you felt lost, well, avoid that feeling again and ask questions. Again, you can use the chat, Steph. That chat. It's for the groups. To my understanding, it's supposed to provide you with a chat that you reach your the people within your group. If Canvas is telling me the truth, which I'm not 100% sure, but I think that's the way it's supposed to work. Mm-hmm.